Hi guys. Today we will start with the story, What Really Happened to the Ninth Legion? The Rise of the Ninth. The Ninth Legion, one of the most respected in the Roman Empire, was famed for its discipline and unwavering loyalty. Elite warriors, hardened in countless battles, they were sent to northern Britain, a land covered in dense forests and inhabited by warlike tribes. The legion's commander, Marcus Junius, a stern but just man, knew the task ahead was not easy. Not just to suppress uprisings, but to establish a lasting Roman presence in these harsh lands. The legion marched on, building fortifications, exploring new territories, and engaging in battles with local tribes. Each day brought new challenges: unpredictable weather, swampy terrain, sudden enemy attacks. But the Ninth did not falter. They moved forward like a dark storm, covering the land and striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. The long march north. The legion continued its march deep into northern Britain, where the land grew increasingly hostile. Swamps and dense forests, difficult to cross even on foot, turned the journey into a test of endurance and patience. The sky was often covered with leaden clouds, and heavy rains made every step heavy and dangerous. Each morning, the legionaries rose at dawn, broke camp, and pressed forward, never knowing what awaited them ahead. Commander Marcus Junius maintained strict discipline. Fatigue and fear could not be allowed. He understood that only iron will and order would help them survive in these lands. The tribes inhabiting these areas were unlike any they had faced before. Fierce nomads, masters of ambush and guerrilla tactics, their knowledge of the terrain gave them a huge advantage. Frequent night attacks and ambushes wore down the Romans, forcing them to fight for their lives repeatedly. Despite this, the legion built fortifications, set watchposts, and established communication between detachments. Experienced scouts were sent ahead to study the land and gather intelligence about the enemy. Marcus often struggled with doubts. Could they fulfill their orders and avoid becoming a forgotten unit lost in the dark forests? But he kept them in line, reminding them of duty, honor, and those waiting for their return in Rome. Deep in the northern forests, months had passed since the Ninth Legion entered the harsh lands of northern Britain. Gradually, the units pushed deeper into the dense forests, where every tree seemed like a living, menacing guardian. The weather became increasingly unpredictable. Cold downpours often turned the ground into sticky mud, making movement difficult. The enemy seized every opportunity. The local tribes knew every bend of the rivers and every path through the woods. Their attacks grew more cunning: night ambushes, sudden raids, and setting fire to camps. The Romans were forced to shift to guerrilla tactics, learning to hide and strike unexpectedly. The soldiers were exhausted, but did not give up. Determination burned in their hearts, the desire to return home and preserve the legion's honor. Marcus Junius inspected the fortifications daily, monitored morale, and upheld discipline. In one battle, part of the standard, the Roman eagle, the legion's symbol and pride, was lost during the chaos of fighting. This was a heavy blow for all. Without the eagle, it seemed the legion lost part of its soul. A few of the bravest warriors formed a unit, determined to retrieve the lost standard at any cost. They knew that success could restore the fighting spirit and change their fate. However, the forest held many secrets. Each day, enemies drew closer, and chances to maneuver grew fewer. The Ninth Legion found itself trapped, and the fight for survival was just beginning. The last battle and retreat into the shadows. A brave unit led by Captain Gaius Flavius set out on a perilous mission to recover the lost legion's eagle. They moved cautiously along narrow paths, avoiding enemy patrols, relying on their knowledge of the forest and careful stealth. Every step was filled with danger. The nomads set ambushes in the most unexpected places, their eyes seeming everywhere. Several times the group narrowly escaped death, saved only by quick thinking and coordinated teamwork. Soon they reached a ruined fortification, where rumors said the eagle was kept. A fierce battle ensued with local warriors. It lasted for hours, but thanks to the courage and discipline of the Romans, They managed to reclaim the eagle. However, the return journey was no less perilous. On the way back, the unit was ambushed, suffering heavy losses. The captain was seriously wounded, but the eagle was saved. When the unit returned to camp, the Legion's spirit was lifted. The eagle once again flew over the Roman tents, a symbol of hope and strength. But the celebration was short-lived. The enemies increased their pressure, and the Legion's resources were running low. Marcus understood that they either had to find a way to survive or perish here, deep in the dark forest. Shadows of the approaching threat. With the eagle's return, it seemed hope had been rekindled in the hearts of the legionaries. But the forest showed no mercy. Every night around the camp, voices and footsteps echoed, as if shadows of an invisible enemy were tightening their grip. Marcus understood the enemy would give them no respite. He ordered to strengthen the watch, to redistribute forces so any sudden attack could be met with preparation. The survivors learned new tactics: scouting, night raids, quick movements. Food and medical supplies were rapidly dwindling, and each day became a test of endurance. Many soldiers were worn out not only by battles, but also by illnesses caused by dampness and exhaustion. Meanwhile, the local tribes united, realizing they could deliver the final blow to the Romans. They knew if the ninth fell, all resistance would collapse. Harsh days and unexpected losses, time in the forests of northern Britain passed slowly and heavily, like the sticky mud beneath their feet. Each morning, the legionaries rose with a cold fear of the new day, because with every hour the enemy grew more relentless and their own strength weakened. Disease and exhaustion devoured their ranks, and the wounded who had even the slightest chance of survival became burdens that had to be carried along. The days became an endless sequence of patrols and ineffective skirmishes, where every fight ended in losses. The unpredictable nature of the forest made even a simple patrol difficult. Swamps, dense thickets, and paths that could not be read made every movement deadly. Marcus Junius kept his soldiers constantly tense, knowing that only discipline and order could save them in these conditions. He organized short drills even in camp to maintain morale, but each time he saw how the soldiers' eyes filled more and more with weariness and despair. On one of these exhausting days, tragedy struck. During a reconnaissance mission in the dark woods, one of their best officers, Tribune Livius, was captured and killed. His loss struck the whole camp hard. He was not only a strategist, but a symbol of strength, whom the soldiers looked up to. A sense of hopelessness began to spread among the warriors. If even the strongest and most experienced were falling, who could lead them forward? Despite everything, Marcus refused to let fear take hold of the Legion. He personally participated in every review, spoke to every soldier, reminding them of duty, of their families waiting for them in Rome. And that defeat was not their fate, but the forest kept pressing on them with its darkness and cold, and every step was a step into the unknown. Hope in the depths of the forest weeks passed, during which the Ninth Legion lived as if on the edge between life and death. Every dawn brought new trials. Cold rain soaked them through, bare branches scratched their skin, and heavy boots sank into the swamp as if pulling them into the abyss. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and rot, and the silence of the forest was so dense that they seemed to hear their own breathing. Marcus Junius did not let the soldiers forget that each of them was part of Rome's great history. He gathered his officers and spoke again about discipline and the need to remain steadfast. They devised new plans for sudden attacks, learned to trap the enemy using the same guerrilla tactics taught by the Britons. Each day brought small victories and defeats. A scouting group led by the young centurion Aurelius discovered a secret path through the marshes that allowed them to bypass enemy ambushes. This discovery gave the Legion a small but vital chance for maneuver. However, the forest was not their only enemy. The night hours brought fear. In the dark, it was easy to lose a comrade, trip, or fall victim to a sudden attack. Many soldiers began suffering from insomnia and nightmares. The camp doctors did their best to aid the wounded and sick, but supplies were nearly gone. At this time, a message arrived from scouts. Several tribes had united into a powerful alliance, preparing for a decisive offensive. This news heightened the sense of anxiety even more. Yet, despite all this, Marcus noticed sparks of a new fire among the soldiers. Spontaneous smiles, quiet talks of returning home, small acts of mutual help. This was the spirit of the Legion, unbreakable. He understood that if they could hold on for at least one more month, they might have a chance to change the course of history. Winds of change. With each passing day, the pressure on the 9th Legion grew more intense. The United Tribes of Britain not only increased their assaults, but learned to exploit the Romans' weaknesses, setting traps and blocking retreat paths. Tension filled the camp. Soldiers no longer just feared. They understood a decisive battle awaited them, one that would determine their fate. Marcus Junius spent long hours poring over strategic maps, trying to predict the enemy's moves and find even the smallest gap in their encirclement. But the forest seemed alive, turning all plans to dust. Every morning brought new hardships. Flooded roads, disrupted supplies, fatigue, and illness continued to wear down the Legion's strength. One dark, cold evening, as thick fog enveloped the camp, Marcus gathered the council of elders and officers. Their conversation was heavy and full of doubt, but their resolve was unshakable. They would not let the 9th vanish without a trace. At that time, a unit led by Centurion Aurelius was ordered to scout deeper into the forest to find alternative routes to a safe zone. It was a dangerous mission, nearly a march to death, but refusal meant certain destruction for the camp. Aurelius, with 20 soldiers, set out knowing their return might be impossible. Their path wound through the most impenetrable parts of the forest, where every trail could be a trap and every rustle a harbinger of attack. Meanwhile, the camp struggled to survive. The medics did their best to treat the wounded, and soldiers shared their last food supplies. Talks of home and family became a comfort that kept them standing. Marcus could not afford weakness. He knew the Legion's fate hung by a thin thread, and the only way to salvation was through endurance, unity, and unwavering will. Journey into the unknown depths. Centurion Aurelius's unit ventured deeper into the forest. Each step grew heavier. The early morning greeted them with darkness and dampness, the air thick with the dense scent of wet earth and moss. The path wound through thickets and swamps, where even the most experienced warriors struggled to keep their balance. Aurelius knew their mission was not just reconnaissance, but the search for hope for the entire Legion. They moved silently, tensely listening to every sound. A slight rustle in the bushes made everyone hold their breath. Every tree could hide an enemy. Every trail could be a trap. As they advanced, the group encountered the first signs of tribal presence. Broken arrows, traces of camps and fires. The Briton warriors knew these lands intimately and were unwilling to give them up without a fight. The first serious contact came after several days. At dawn, the unit walked into an ambush. Enemy warriors, hidden among the trees, opened fire with bows and throwing spears. The Romans quickly organized, using their close combat experience, and launched a counterattack. The fight was fierce, every meter gained with great effort. Despite heavy losses, Aurelius managed to lead his men out of encirclement. However, some were wounded or lost, and morale was stretched to the limit. After the battle, they took shelter in an abandoned hut to catch their breath and plan the next steps. Aurelius understood their path was perilous, but there was no other choice. If they did not find a safe route, the Legion was doomed. Back at the camp, Marcus Junius waited anxiously for news. Every day without word from the unit increased his fear for his men's fate. He strengthened the defenses, prepared for the worst, but did not lose faith. Meanwhile, the forest grew even more hostile. Constant rain washed away paths, swamps expanded, and the cold pierced to the bone. The Legion needed to find a way out of this nightmare, but it seemed unreachable. A labyrinth with no exit days, blurred into weeks as Aurelius's unit delved deeper into the forests, where every tree seemed a silent witness to their struggle. Heavy boots left prints in the damp earth, and the soldiers' faces grew increasingly gaunt from exhaustion and constant tension. The path they had chosen was not just a test of physical strength. It was a trial of will and spirit. Many times they encountered trails leading to dead ends, or found places where the ground gave way into marshes. Water reached their knees, and the cold wind pierced through to the bone. One night, while camped in a small clearing, Aurelius noticed strange tracks, prints unlike those of humans. They were larger than those of ordinary warriors, and the shape of the toes seemed different. This added new fears. It seemed the forest hid something more than just enemy tribes. The group became even more cautious. Every step was followed by careful inspection of the terrain, and sentries were doubled. Rumors spread within the unit about mysterious creatures inhabiting the forest and ancient legends told by the locals. However, Aurelius stayed focused. He understood that legends were only fear they had to overcome if they wanted to complete their mission. He had to encourage the soldiers daily, reminding them that every step they took was a step towards saving the entire Legion. Meanwhile, back at Marcus Junius's camp, the situation grew critical. Food supplies were running low, and the wounded required constant care. Many legionaries began suffering from exhaustion and scurvy, but despair was replaced by resolve when they saw their commander refusing to give up and leading them forward. Every night, the sounds of the forest grew closer. Warriors' cries, the noise of footsteps that seemed more threatening by the day. The Legion felt surrounded not only by the physical wall of trees and swamps, but by an approaching darkness that could not be seen but was felt. The pulsing darkness. With each passing night, the forest around grew more sinister and dense, as if a living entity, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. The wind rustled through the branches, creating strange sounds that unsettled even the most experienced warriors. Shadows seemed longer, and the night deeper and colder. The legionaries, already accustomed to constant fear, began to notice that the usual wild sounds of the forest were changing into something else. Faint footsteps, soft breathing, unclear rustling. Many nights passed without sleep as the soldiers listened intently, ready for a sudden attack. Marcus Junius could not afford weakness. He knew that if the Legion lost its spirit, it was doomed. He pushed the soldiers to keep working even when they were on the brink of exhaustion. Morning marches, training sessions, and tactical discussions maintained order and discipline, preventing despair from creeping into their hearts. Aurelius and his unit pressed deeper into the impenetrable thickets. Each day they faced new obstacles: fallen trees, tangled brush, swamps, and fast-flowing rivers. Sometimes they had to move almost blindly, battling insects and enduring relentless rain. Yet even amid this harsh struggle, moments of humanity emerged. Brief conversations around the fire, memories of home and family, quiet jokes, and mutual support. This was their last refuge in this merciless world. One day, as they ventured deeper into the forest, Aurelius noticed the thicket beginning to part, revealing a small valley hidden from prying eyes. This could be salvation, a new chance for the Legion. But along with this discovery came the feeling that they were approaching something ancient and powerful. Secrets the forest had kept for centuries. Secrets of the hidden valley. The valley that opened before Aurelius's unit seemed an incredible oasis amidst the dark and dangerous forests. Tall trees formed a natural barrier around it, as if nature itself had decided to shield this place from prying eyes. Light filtered through the thick foliage, illuminating soft grass and a small lake with clear water. Aurelius understood this place could become the saving refuge desperately needed by his unit and the entire 9th Legion. Here they could catch their breath, replenish water supplies, and even try to restore the strength of the sick and wounded. But despite the apparent idle, the unit did not lower its guard. They knew that here, deep in Britain, every silence could conceal danger. The usual forest sounds were replaced by noises hard to comprehend, strange rustlings, barely perceptible movements in the shadows. The first several days in the valley passed in relative calm. The soldiers built temporary shelters, organized security, and restored combat readiness. Medics cared for the wounded, and Marcus Junius received new reports from Aurelius that gave hope. However, after a week, something happened that shook the entire unit. One night, the sentries noticed movement at the forest's edge. Not enemies or ordinary tribes, but people with a different appearance and manner. They looked wild, but showed no aggression, as if watching the Romans from afar. Marcus decided to send a small scouting party to try to understand who these strange people were and what their intentions might be. Aurelius, with several soldiers, headed toward the mysterious figures. The meeting was tense. The newcomers spoke a language unlike any known Roman dialect, but their gestures were peaceful. Gradually, contact was established. They learned these were a tribe of ancient forest guardians, people who knew the secrets of the land and could either help or harm them. This encounter opened new horizons, an understanding that the Ninth Legion faced not just survival among enemies, but a struggle for its place in a world full of unexplored mysteries and powers. Alliance with the Guardians. The meeting with the tribe of forest guardians became a turning point for Aurelius's unit and the entire Ninth Legion. These people, calling themselves the Silvani, were keepers of ancient knowledge and traditions passed down through generations deep within the British forests. Their lives were inseparably connected to nature. They knew secret paths, water sources, medicinal plants, and ways to survive in the harshest conditions. Aurelius and Marcus realized that an alliance with the Silvani was the only chance to survive in this god-forsaken land. The tribe's representatives showed the Romans safe routes, places to hide from enemy tribes, and lands rich in resources. However, this alliance demanded trust and mutual understanding, and the Romans had many doubts. Their upbringing and duty to Rome prevented them from immediately accepting a foreign culture and customs. Some legionaries viewed the Silvani with suspicion, others with open curiosity. Aurelius took on the role of mediator. He learned the Guardians' language, customs, and tried to understand their way of life. Slowly but surely, a fragile friendship began to form between the two worlds. Meanwhile, the unit started building fortifications in the valley, using the advice and help of their new allies. They dug trenches, erected fences from wood and stone, and created hidden observation posts to keep the enemy in fear and prevent unnoticed advances. Marcus in the camp continued to maintain the legion's fighting spirit, sharing news of Aurelius's successes. He understood that the battle was now not only against external enemies, but also against inner doubts and fears. In the valley, amidst the wild nature under the vaulted branches of ancient trees, the Roman legionaries felt for the first time that they could not only survive but find meaning in their mission, to preserve the honor and name of the Ninth Legion despite all trials. But ahead lay new hardships, dangers hidden in the forest shadows, betrayals and cruel trials that would either temper their spirit or destroy them forever. The weight of memory and the steel of discipline. Despite the temporary reprieve in the valley, fear and anxiety never left the hearts of the legionaries. Each night they fell asleep with a sword on their chest and awoke expecting an attack. Even under the protection of fortifications and with allies nearby, the Ninth Legion felt the earth beneath their feet breathing, not peacefully, but with restrained rage. Among the soldiers, memories began to resurface of the march that had led them into this trap. Aurelius often caught himself thinking about the beginning, how they had left the walls of Eboracum under the command of Prefect Augustus, confident that glory awaited them. Hundreds of soldiers lined up in perfect order, banners fluttering in the wind, the legion's eagle shining in the first light of dawn. They marched north to subdue the rebellious tribes, restore order, and advance the power of Rome. But step by step, the road became more hostile. At first, there were ambushes, then patrols began to vanish without a trace. One day, an entire cohort disappeared. The land began to swallow bodies, the forest, men. The enemy took no prisoners, refused open battle. They waged a war of shadows. As the first defeat struck the legion, discipline became a pillar, not a habit. Soldiers obeyed orders, not out of loyalty, but desperation. If they broke formation, it was over. Every hammer strike on a nail in a barricade, every patrol step around the camp wasn't routine. It was survival, an effort to stay sane in a world that was falling apart. Marcus Junius, despite his soldiers' suffering, stuck to the plan. Hold out at any cost until Aurelius found a way. He refused rest, ate with the common troops, oversaw the fortifications, addressed the units. His voice carried no pomp, only restrained strength. We are the 9th. We will not be erased. We will not vanish into the forest. Meanwhile, Aurelius dove deeper into the knowledge of the Silvani. He studied not only their maps and trails, but their logic of warfare in this land. The Guardians knew how enemies moved, what a trace on the grass meant, how to read bird cries to know if men had passed. This wasn't Roman tactics. It was the tactics of the land. And he learned. The valley was no longer just a shelter. It became a school of survival, an arena where the Legion was rediscovering itself. Every soldier felt it. A battle awaited them. Not just any battle, but the final chapter of a great story. One that would either be etched into legend or wiped away in oblivion. The breath of war. 2 months had passed since Aurelius's detachment entered the valley. The once threatening and unknown terrain around them had become part of their new map, drawn not with ink, but with earth, grass, and blood. They knew every rocky outcrop, every fallen oak, every hidden trail between the trees. All of it became both their shield and their trap. The soldiers, once accustomed to the straight roads of the empire, to shouted orders and the beat of drums, now moved like shadows. They had become part of the forest. There was no longer the Roman rigidity in their movements, but there was the precision of a hunter. Each warrior knew where to step, how to listen to silence, and where to hide should the tribes appear again. The Silvani taught them not only how to survive, but how to be patient. War here would not be won in a single battle. The enemy did not form ranks or wait on the battlefield. He lived all around, in villages and caves in the thickets, and struck when least expected. He was rain, not a storm. He didn't crush, but slowly eroded everything that stood in his way. Aurelius realized this too late, when they lost another scouting unit. 3 soldiers vanished without a trace, and were later found dead, bound, throats slit, their bodies displayed as a message. It was a sign. The enemy was watching, and he was waiting. Marcus Junius ordered all posts reinforced, patrols doubled, all travel routes changed. He trusted nothing habitual. Routine was death. He began night drills, waking legionaries an hour before dawn, simulating surprise attacks. Those who didn't awaken within 10 heartbeats went without food. Those who failed to don their armor in time stood watch all day. The soldiers were angry, but they obeyed. They were beginning to understand. Each day here was borrowed time, and if they weren't ready, death wouldn't wait. Meanwhile, lasting bonds began to form between the legionaries and the Silvani. The young centurion Flavius, a harsh and reserved man, learned to speak the language of the forest people. He even took part in one of their rites, where the forest judged a stranger, friend or foe. After the rite, the Silvani began to call him White Wolf, for his weathered pale hair and predator's gaze He became a symbol of the Ninth's new face, no longer purely Roman but hardened, adapted to these lands. Yet the Legion as a whole felt the calm slipping away. In the quiet of the valley, tension was rising. The birds sang less. The nights grew darker, the winds harsher. The Sylvanis' eyes showed fear they didn't hide. Some said the tribes were uniting. Others whispered that the chieftain of the northern clans, Morkan, was preparing a strike. Aurelius knew, if it were true, war wouldn't come tomorrow, would come tonight, and the Ninth would have to endure. The Night of Ash. As the sun slipped behind the forest and the sky turned the color of rust and steel, the soldiers of the Ninth felt it. This was no ordinary evening. The silence was unnatural, like the stillness before a storm, and the air carried the scent of wet iron, ash, and something else. Ancient, wild, suffocating. Aurelius stood at the lookout on the camp's edge. His face was still, but his hands gripped the hilt of his gladius tighter than usual. Beside him stood an old Sylvany elder named Hairn. He said quietly, "The forest is silent. That means it's listening. It knows blood is coming." And in that very instant, as if his words had opened a gate, the forest came alive. Somewhere far off, a bird cried, not in fear, but as a signal. More sounds followed. The cracking of branches, heavy footsteps, dull thuds of ritual drums. They were coming. Marcus Junius gave the alarm. Fires that had been lit only in the camp's center were doused to conceal their glow. Soldiers took their positions behind the fortifications, archers on the wooden platforms, spearmen by the breaches, stone throwers behind makeshift walls. In the center, like a beating heart, stood the standard of the Ninth, the golden eagle, unblinking, proud. Then the first wave came. The tribes attacked in surging waves, not in formation like the Romans, but with the fury of beasts. They burst from the darkness, screaming, carrying torches and spears, pounding drums of hide, charging the defenses with savage determination. Many wore no armor, their faces and bodies painted like ghosts of forgotten gods. The first wave was repelled. The archers struck from above, the spearmen held the passages, and the swordsmen countered with disciplined violence, pushing the attackers back into the trees. But no one cheered. Everyone knew. This was only the beginning. The second wave came from another direction. The enemy knew the camp's weaknesses. In the dark, they crept through the thickets and struck from the south, where the ground was swampy and hard to defend. The garrison there was made up mostly of the wounded and new recruits. The protective wall was weaker, and the screams from that side were sharp and desperate. Aurelius rushed there himself, rallying a dozen veterans. They stormed into the fray at its height. Blades slashed, shields cracked, bodies fell in the mud. By the fire, where the enemy had broken through, Aurelius saw a tribal chief, tall, bare-chested, wearing a horned helmet and a wolf tattoo, fighting two legionaries at once. Aurelius faced him. In a flash, their duel began. Blows rained down from both sides. The chieftain struck wildly with a rage that seemed immune to pain. Aurelius moved with precision, defending, waiting. Lightning flashed somewhere overhead, and in its light, Aurelius landed a strike. Not fatal, but enough to force the enemy back. The chieftain growled and retreated into the shadows. It was a warning. He would return. By morning, the attacks had ceased. Bodies lay around the fires, Roman and barbarian alike. The camp still stood, but every man knew. Now the true war had begun. The threat no longer hid. It had shown its face, and with full force. The Sylvani were stunned. Never before had the tribes united in such numbers. It meant only one thing. Morkan, the northern warlord, had begun his campaign. He had rallied the clans, and now their goal was not just the camp, but the very soul of the Ninth Legion. Aurelius understood. To survive, they couldn't just defend. They would have to strike first. They would have to go on the offensive. Steel shadows of dawn. The morning after the attack brought no celebration, only heavy silence. Smoke from burned torches and charred bodies hung over the camp like a shroud. Birds that usually sang at sunrise were silent. Everything living seemed to hold its breath. Even the forest waited. Aurelius walked the perimeter, paying no mind to the blood on the stones and soil. He was counting bodies. 16 legionaries dead. 7 seriously wounded. 4 missing without a trace. No one even tried to count the enemy dead. The tribes took many of their fallen back into the forest, but dozens remained in the mud, faces twisted and teeth bared. Exhausted, worn, but alive. That was what the 9th Legion looked like now. No longer a jewel of the Empire, but survivors. Men who had looked into the abyss and still stood. In the command tent, at the fortified heart of the camp, the mood was grim. The map, already torn and stained, lay across the table. Marcus Junius stared at it as if he could find a way out of this trap by will alone. "We can't wait for the next strike," Aurelius said, breaking the silence. "Morkan knows where we are. He knows what we can do, and he knows we're few. He's gathering strength. When he's ready, we'll be wiped out." "We don't know where his camp is," Tribune Sylvan replied. "These forests are vast. One wrong move, and we're the prey." "But we have allies," Aurelius answered, nodding toward Heron, the Sylvani elder who entered the tent. The old man bowed. "They know the paths. They know the tribes. They will lead us." And so it was decided. A strike force of 100 of their best, traveling light and fast with minimal baggage. The mission to find and destroy the outposts of the tribes, to bleed Morkan's ranks before he could gather them. It wasn't an offensive in the Roman sense. It was a hunt. Within 2 days, preparations were complete. Soldiers checked their weapons, reinforced their armor. Helmets were blackened to avoid reflection, shields wrapped in dark cloth. Horses stayed behind. Every step had to be silent. Even the swords were bound at the scabbard to keep them from clinking. Aurelius led from the front, alongside Heron and 2 young Sylvani scouts. The men followed in a long, quiet line, as if the forest itself had let them in. The first target was a watch hill near the Cleote Pass. Rumor had it, tribal chiefs were gathering there, along with supplies and warriors. It took 3 nights to reach it, moving in darkness, hiding in hollows, and beneath thick branches during the day. The hill was ringed by a palisade and guarded by dozens. But the Romans had a gift the tribes did not: discipline. When the fog rolled in just before dawn, they struck. The attack was swift. No cries, no trumpets. Spears to the heart, knives to the throat. A few sentries raised the alarm, but it was too late. The camp was already burning. Those who tried to flee were cut down in the mist. In the ashes, they found something vital: a map, crude, burned into hide, marked with symbols, but it was enough. Morkan was closer than they had thought. Aurelius stood over the body of a slain chieftain, his face blackened with soot and blood. Clutched in the dead man's hand was a crude amulet, made from claw and tooth, a trophy. Aurelius took it and tossed it into the fire. "This is only the beginning," he said. "The 9th is coming." The trail of blood. The fire was still smoldering in the destroyed camp at the Cleo Pass when the 9th scouts vanished back into the forest. There was no time to lose. Smoke trailed high into the sky, and the enemy would surely notice. But now, the Legion had an edge. A map burned into hide, marked with key points, hidden paths, supply caches, and most importantly, a symbol of 2 circles. Heron explained, this was the lair of Morkan. Marcus Junius and Aurelius didn't return to the main camp. Instead, they made a decision to burn the rot out before it spread. The remaining 87 soldiers, 13 had already fallen or were left wounded in the pass battle, agreed without hesitation. No one asked mercy from fate. They were already dead to Rome, but alive here. in the heart of barbarian darkness, and thus free. The days that followed became a blur of endless marches, skirmishes, and ghosts of the past. Every step brought tension. Every sound in the forest felt like a trap. The tribes began to hunt them in small groups, laying ambushes and false trails. The forest turned against them. At the foot of the Griven Hills, they discovered a hollow, a place of gathering for druids. Despite Hearn's protests, Aurelius led the troops inside. He didn't believe in ancient magic, but he knew the value of information. What they found was not a place of power, but of terror. A cave filled with human bones strung on cords, moss dolls defaced with symbols. This was no shrine. It was a den of fanatics. And among them, Roman prisoners. 5 legionaries of the 9th, once thought lost, were found chained to the rocks. One still lived, barely breathing. The others hadn't survived the torture. Aurelius looked into the lifeless eyes of one, Publius, a brother in arms from his earliest campaigns, and felt fury boil within him. They interrogated the fanatics quickly. One spoke broken Latin. Morkan's name came up again and again, along with new phrases. The patron, fire spirit, night watcher. One of the Silvani scouts whispered, Morkan had united not just men, but fear, and made it into a weapon. On the 6th day of the march, drained and grim, the unit reached a cliff overlooking a valley shrouded in mist. Below, in its heart, stood a stronghold. Not a village, not a fort, but something more. Stone rings, wooden towers, and trophy heads on pikes. And at the main gate, a symbol visible even from afar. The eagle, the golden eagle of the 9th Legion. It had been bound to a tall pole, crucified like a prize. Beneath it, a crowd. Dozens, maybe hundreds of warriors. And among them a figure cloaked in fur and iron, hooded and still. Morkan. Aurelius stared without blinking. His fists clenched. He didn't know who had betrayed them, who had survived, who had lost the eagle. But he knew one thing. Their honor still lived, and it could be reclaimed. Even at the cost of blood, even if no one returned to tell it. We don't wait for night, he said. We give them no chance. We go, and we take it back. And the soldiers nodded. Not for the Empire, not for glory, for the 9th. For those who lay in the dirt, in the forests, alone. For every man who once marched in formation. Night was falling over the valley, but the 9th Legion marched to battle once more, in the shadow of the eagle. That evening, the air was heavy with foreboding. The forest, usually alive and noisy, seemed to hold its breath, listening to the approaching assault force of the 9th Legion. Every movement was honed by years of training, the sound of straps, the metallic clang of armor, the faint scraping of sand beneath heavy sandals. Aurelius marched at the front of the column, eyes fixed ahead, on the frozen mirror of the valley where the eagle hung, desecrated and battered. He thought of every one of his men, those left behind in camp, those who had fallen, those missing. He understood. Now their fate, honor, and memory of the 9th would be decided. The path to the stronghold was arduous. Thick forest surrounded it on 3 sides, like a living labyrinth filled with traps and ambushes. Behind every tree could lurk an enemy. Every trail led to danger. The legionaries moved in complete silence, exchanging signals through faint shield taps and quick gestures. Approaching the outpost, they saw figures flickering in the mist. Barbarians patrolled the area, clad in leather armor, ready with spears and bows. But the 9th had a strategy. They set an ambush. Hiding behind trees, the unit split into several groups. Some moved around to block possible escape routes. Others waited for the signal to strike swiftly. Everyone knew the main goal, to prevent the enemy from hiding and regrouping. At the moment the sun set behind the horizon, painting the sky in bloody light, a soft whistle sounded, the attack signal. Warriors burst from the shadows, howling, fighting not just for life, but for memory and honor. The clash of swords, clang of metal, and cries of barbarians blended into one. The battle raged long and fiercely. The barbarians refused to surrender without a fight, but the Ninth Legion fought like a blazing blade, piercing the darkness. Every strike was precise, every movement calculated. Slowly but surely, they took the stronghold. In the heart of the fight, Aurelius spotted Morkan's figure, tall, clad in fur and iron, face hidden by a hood. He led his warriors with fierce rage and cruelty. Aurelius knew victory would be hard-won. But just when the battle seemed endless and the defenders were tiring, the situation changed. The Silvani, who had guided the legion, emerged from the forest with reinforcements. A small band of their warriors armed with bows and spears. Their precise arrows struck the barbarians, breaking their lines. This gave the Ninth new momentum. They surged forward, broke through defenses, and reached the place where the eagle hung. Aurelius removed the standard. The eagle was scratched and wounded, but still proud and majestic. Raising it high, he shouted to his men, "For the Ninth! For Rome! For honor!" The reply was a mighty roar that shook the forest. It was a moment of rebirth, the moment darkness began to recede. Yet the price was high. Among the fallen was Heron, the old Silvani who had guided them through many trials. His death left a void in the warriors' hearts, but the memory of him inspired them to move forward, to new battles and victories. The legion retreated back to camp, carrying the wounded and trophies. The eagle was once again their symbol, and the story of that day became a legend to be told for years to come. Shadows of the past. After the fierce battle, when the first rays of dawn touched the treetops, the Ninth Legion returned to their camp, where a deadly silence reigned. It seemed as if the earth itself mourned the fallen. There were too many, valiant warriors whose names would be erased by time if no witnesses remained. Aurelius stood on a hill, looking at the remnants of the stronghold where the desecrated eagle had hung. His heart was heavy, not only because of the losses, but also because an unknown future lay ahead, a road paved with blood and secrets. The camp was inspected, the wounded tended to, but unease did not leave the legionaries. Rumors of traitors, spies, and hidden enemies within their ranks grew with each hour. No one could trust anyone as before. Among the soldiers, a feeling arose that fate itself had turned away from them. Aurelius summoned the officers to a council. A decision had to be made, to advance deeper into the barbarian lands, or to retreat and preserve what remained. But no one wanted to speak of defeat. The Ninth was known for its resilience and pride. This was their last chance to cleanse their name. At the council, it was decided to send scouts deep into the forests to gather information about Morkan's camp, how many forces he had, and what his plans were. Everyone understood the enemy was not just a rebel. He was a man who united barbarian tribes, forging fear itself into a true army. Aurelius sent a detachment composed of the best archers and trackers. With them went Hrist, the youngest legionary, who had impressed him not only with skill, but also with determination. It was a risky move, but there was no other choice. The scouts' path led through dense forests, swamps, and tangled trails. Every step was a test. They encountered wild animals, avoided traps, and listened to the sounds of the night, trying not to reveal their presence. The sense of danger grew with each passing minute. Deep in the forest, the scouts stumbled upon a village, inhabited by Morkan's allies. A mix of tribes united under his banner. The houses were made of wood and stone, surrounded by a palisade guarded by barbarians. The atmosphere was tense, charged with readiness for war. They observed the barbarians gathering, preparing for another battle. New weapon workshops and smithies were visible, forging spears and swords. Training grounds where young warriors learned to fight and handle bows were also seen. The scouts understood. The war was only beginning. Morkan was not going to surrender. He was building not just a camp, but a true fortress, ready to withstand a siege. Returning to camp, The scouts brought grim news. Aurelius realized he faced a long and exhausting path ahead. But he knew the Legion must endure, or the name of the Ninth would be forever swallowed by the darkness of oblivion. Depths of the forest and the treachery of alliances. Long hours dragged on as the scouts slowly made their way through the impenetrable forest thickets. Branches whipped at their faces, roots threatened to trip them at every step, and the dense darkness concealed many dangers. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of animals or distant rolls of thunder. Christ, the young legionary, walked with a tense gaze and heavy breathing. Each step was a test of endurance and the ability to remain calm. He knew that not just their lives, but the fate of the entire legion was at stake. Along the way, the group encountered signs of human presence. Campfires, abandoned hunting camps, hoof prints in the soft earth. With each minute, it became clearer. They were approaching enemy territory, where every mistake could cost them their lives. At night, the scouts camped beneath thick tree canopies, avoiding fire to stay hidden. Conversations were minimal, and every gaze was fixed into the darkness, as if trying to spot an unseen enemy. In the morning, the scouts continued, trying to stay away from main paths. Soon, they came across a larger settlement with several dozen buildings, surrounded by a palisade and guarded by watchposts. Life went on here. Women prepared food, children played safely, and men prepared for battle. Price noticed the tribe leader, a massive man with scars on his face, talking to a foreigner clad in armor, likely an officer from Morkan's camp. This alliance was unexpected. Barbarians had accepted Romans, who were exiled from legions or had left on their own. This fact spoke of the seriousness and scale of the enemy's preparations. The scouts observed, studied, and memorized. Their task was to gather as much information as possible so Aurelius could plan an attack or defense. But time was against them. The enemy was preparing, and the Legion had fewer resources and strength. On the way back to camp, they were ambushed by barbarians. Fleeing and fighting off enemies, they realized that the enemy was not only strong in numbers, but also skilled in ambush tactics and guerrilla warfare. Upon returning, they reported everything to Aurelius. The moment had come when choosing between advancing and retreating seemed impossible. But the legionnaires had only one path: to fight to the end, bearing the honor of the Ninth, or to vanish into the abyss of oblivion, the last stronghold. Returning to the camp after the failed reconnaissance, Aurelius gathered the council of senior officers. Around him were stern faces, veterans who had survived many battles, but now their eyes showed fatigue and worry. They knew ahead was not just a battle, but a fight for the very essence of the Legion. Aurelius spoke quietly but firmly. He understood their situation was critical. Resources were running low, morale was broken, and the enemy was closing in. He saw that for most soldiers, the hard days had become routine, and if they didn't find new motivation now, the Legion would fall apart. At that moment, he proposed a risky plan: to rely on a fortified camp and defend to the last. Their strength was not just in numbers, but in discipline and endurance. Besieged, they could use natural barriers and turn fortifications into an impregnable fortress. At the same time, Aurelius knew they had to abandon the dream of returning to Rome as a great legion. Now their task was to survive, preserve their honor, and at least partially avenge their enemy. Work on strengthening the camp began immediately. The soldiers cut down trees, dug ditches, built wooden walls and towers. Everyone understood this was a matter of their lives and fate. Days dragged slowly. Every dawn brought new anxieties. Enemy scouts appeared, distant cries and shots echoed. At times, attacks became fierce. The barbarians tried to break through, but the soldiers held their formation, giving them no chance. A tense silence reigned in the camp, broken only by the sounds of hammers and axes. Everyone dreamed of peace, but prepared for war. Aurelius walked the ranks, encouraging the fighters, reminding them what they were fighting for the Ninth's honor, for their comrades, for a future still possible to build. Among the legionnaires, a spirit of unity was born. They shared the last supplies, helped the wounded, told stories of past campaigns, recalling days when their legion was mighty and invincible. But behind these days of hard work loomed a shadow. The enemy army grew, gathering for a decisive attack. The barbarians realized there would be no easy victory and prepared to deliver the final blow meant to wipe the 9th Legion off the face of the earth. The night before the storm. Night fell on the fortified camp, shrouding it in darkness and mystery. There was a sense of unease in the air. Every soldier, from the youngest to the officer, sensed the approach of the inevitable. This night was the last moment of silence before the approaching storm. Aurelius stood on the walls of the fortification, looking at the dark outlines of the forest, which hid thousands of enemies. Around him, the legionaries were preparing for battle, sharpening their swords, checking their weapons, adjusting their armor, silently, but with firm determination. A spark of hope burned inside each of them, despite the severity of the coming battle. A special atmosphere reigned in the camp, a mixture of fear and courage. The soldiers shared stories of previous battles, talked about relatives and homes that they might not see again. Many wrote letters to their families, perhaps the last words that will remain in memory of them. Aurelius inspected the guards, listening carefully to the reports. In several places, barbarian movement was noticed. They were preparing for a night assault, hoping to catch the Romans by surprise. But the legion was ready. Walls, ditches, and wooden towers became a reliable defense, and the soldiers, an unyielding barrier. At this time, veterans, the most experienced fighters, were gathering in the depths of the camp to discuss tactics. They knew that this battle could be the last, but no one was thinking about surrender. For them, the 9th is not just a legion. It is a symbol of honor, fortitude, and loyalty. Aurelius addressed the legionnaires with a short speech, without pathos, but from the heart. He reminded them that each of them is a part of great history, that their battle is not only for survival, but also for memories that will remain for centuries. This speech raised the spirit of the soldiers, strengthened their resolve, and filled their hearts with pride. Time passed, and the night grew deeper. The silence was deceptive. Behind the walls of the camp, a threat was gathering, ready to break out. The legionnaires knew tomorrow they would have to face fire, swords, and death. But they were ready. Ready to fight to the end. Dawn of the battle dawn brought no peace. The first rays of the sun had barely touched the treetops when the earth trembled from the approaching footsteps of thousands of barbarian warriors. Their cries echoed through the forest, mixing with the battle roar and the clash of weapons. The fortified camp of the 9th Legion stood like a lonely rock, surrounded by a raging sea of enemy forces. Aurelius stood on the walls of the fortress, carefully observing the enemy. His face, tired but calm, reflected the full weight of responsibility. At this moment, he was not only a commander, but also a father to his soldiers. Every decision could cost them their lives, but capitulation was unacceptable. When the first barbarians tried to break through to the ditches, archers from the fortress walls met them with a hail of arrows, holding back the onslaught. But the enemy was numerous and stubborn. They began to use undermining, arson, and wild cries, trying to break through the defense. The walls shook from the blows of catapults and throwing machines, and the air was filled with smoke and dust. Inside the camp, the legionaries organized a shelter for the wounded, trying to preserve their strength and spirit. The wounded warriors, despite the pain, did not lose consciousness, supporting their comrades. The camp turned into a single organism, where everyone played their role. Someone fought on the walls, someone supplied ammunition, someone treated wounds. Aurelius understood that it would not be possible to defend for long. His strength was running out. He gathered his officers and ordered to prepare a counterattack, hoping to strike at the most critical moment. The warriors prepared for the decisive clash, checking their weapons and putting their armor in order. Hearts beat in unison with the cries of the battle drums. Suddenly, like a flash of lightning, the Roman legionaries rushed forward through the gates, sweeping away the enemy with their discipline and coordination. The counterattack became a test of will and skill, where every maneuver and every blow decided the outcome of the battle. The barbarians, not expecting such fury, retreated, but were already gathering for a new attack. The battle lasted for hours. Blood, sweat, and dust mixed into a single storm of fear and courage. The legionaries knew that their honor and fate depended on this fight. Aurelius, watching the battle, felt how a fire was blazing inside him, feeding the will to win. But the barbarians were not going to give up. They united, changed tactics, trying to find a weak spot in the defense. The war was turning into an exhausting battle of attrition, where every moment could be the last. The battle for honor. The sun rose higher, dispersing the morning mist, but the battle within the fortified camp of the 9th Legion raged on. The cries of warriors, the clash of swords, and the dull thuds of shields filled the air, turning the battlefield into chaos, where only discipline and experience could save lives. The soldiers fought not merely for territory. They fought for their honor, for the name of the legion that had endured through years and wars, for the memory of those who had already fallen, and for those who must survive. Aurelius did not leave the front line, personally leading the soldiers in a counterattack. His face was covered in sweat and dust, his hands gripping his sword tightly, each strike filled with fury and resolve. He knew that if the legion fell today, there would be no chance to return home. But surrender was not an option, under no circumstances. In the heart of the battle unfolded a true contest of minds and willpower. The barbarians used all their knowledge of the forests and terrain, attempting to flank the defenses. They sent swift squads to attack weak points, their shouts adding to the chaos and panic. But the Roman legionaries, trained through thousands of battles, quickly adapted, reorganizing their lines and closing breaches. Many warriors had already fallen. Wounds grew heavier, and strength was running out. At this moment, veterans appeared, old fighters who, despite fatigue and pain, rose up and inspired the rest with their courage. They became an example of what it meant to be a Roman legionary, to stand to the last and never lose faith. In the midst of battle, when it seemed that forces were nearly exhausted, a messenger arrived with reinforcements, a group of soldiers who had survived previous battles and were hiding in the mountains. Their arrival lifted the spirits of the soldiers and gave new momentum to the resistance. These people, worn and hardened, brought with them hope. Aurelius quickly organized them into a shock reserve unit meant to deliver a decisive blow to the main enemy forces. The plan was simple. Hold the defense. Do not let the enemy break through, and wait for the moment to counterattack. The warriors took their positions, preparing for the final push. In their eyes burned determination and readiness to meet death if it came. For them, the 9th Legion was more than just an army. It was a family, a legend, and a symbol of unbreakable will. The battle continued. Every minute became a test of spirit and body. But even in this hell of war, amidst the roar of combat and pain, the Roman warriors stood firm, ready to give everything for their cause. The bloody wave. The sun stood at its zenith, and the heat bore down on the 9th Legion's camp with relentless force. Yet the battle did not cease. It only intensified. The war had turned into an unending stream of blood and suffering, where every second could be fatal. Aurelius felt exhaustion tightening his chest, but his mind remained clear. He saw his soldiers, battered and wounded, still rising to fight. Their ranks thinned, but their spirit did not fade. Every legionary knew, if they gave way, no one would remember the 9th Legion as great. They had only to fight to the last breath. The enemy increased pressure. The barbarians learned from their mistakes and changed tactics, employing new weapons and traps. They surrounded the camp, allowing no chance for retreat or reinforcements. The legionaries were like prey trapped in a deadly snare, but continued their defense with rare resilience. In the heart of the camp, a loud cry rang out. The wounded needed aid, and medics and orderlies worked tirelessly, trying to save everyone. Despite terrible conditions, the warriors shared their last bread and water, supporting each other like brothers. Aurelius understood that saving the legion required more than fighting. It required strategy. He sent scouts to find weak points in the enemy's encirclement. Every moment counted. The scouts returned with troubling news. The enemy planned a new, more powerful assault that could break all the fortifications. Aurelius gathered his officers and prepared a new plan: a night attack on the barbarian camps to weaken their forces and disrupt the offensive. Despite their fatigue, the warriors accepted the order. The operation was risky, but there was no other choice. Under cover of darkness, they moved out of the camp, slipping between trees and stones. Every step was tense. Every sound could betray their presence. The night became a battlefield of stealth warfare. The legionaries fought enemies, trying not to alert the main camp with the sounds of battle. Their goal: to destroy enemy supplies and camps, depriving them of support. The fight lasted until dawn. Exhausted but alive, the legionaries returned to the fortification. They brought back victory and hope. The last stand. After the night operation, the legion's spirit was somewhat strengthened, but physical wounds deepened. The soldiers were visibly fading. Each day felt like a trial, as if the very earth was against them. Yet, in these moments, the true strength of the legion revealed itself in all its power, not just in muscles and weapons, but in unity, unwavering will, and faith in one another. Aurelius understood that the enemy would not retreat. The barbarians, wild and unruly though they were also smart and inventive foes. Their numerical superiority threatened to overwhelm the remnants of Roman discipline. The legionaries could no longer count on reinforcements. They were cut off from the world, as if on the edge of an abyss. The fortress, once thought impregnable, was now becoming a tomb if they did not find a way to break through. The war had turned into a fight for survival, where each day was a step on a razor's edge. But even in such hell, hope did not abandon the warriors. Aurelius ordered the defenses to be strengthened, digging new trenches and building additional barriers. He gathered the soldiers for brief but decisive training sessions, maintaining order and morale. He told them, "We will not fall. We will not forget who we are. The 9th Legion is more than an army. It is the heart of Rome." The soldiers lived under constant pressure from the enemy. The barbarians launched raids and ambushes, trying to breach weak points. Every night turned into endless vigilance as soldiers took turns on watch, not allowing a moment's rest. Among these trials stood out a legionary named Titus. He was young and inexperienced, but already showing the qualities of a true fighter: bravery, resilience, and the ability to make decisions under pressure. His deeds inspired others, and tales of his courage were passed from mouth to mouth. One day, when the barbarians launched an especially fierce assault, Titus and a small group of soldiers held a key point by the camp gates. Surrounded by enemies, wounded and exhausted, they refused to surrender. Their resistance bought time for the rest of the soldiers to regroup and repel the attack. This moment became a symbol of the indomitable spirit of the 9th Legion. Aurelius understood that the story of these people was one of courage and honor that would live on for centuries, even if they did not survive. War forgives no mistakes. Every step was a test, every breath a struggle. But the legionaries continued to stand firm as rock before a storm, ready to fight to the last. Shadows behind the walls. Days turned into weeks, and time seemed frozen in this corner, cut off from the world. The 9th Legion held its ground, though strength slowly drained away. Aurelius watched his men. Each had become part of something greater, part of a living legend. where personal fate dissolved into the fate of the entire legion. The enemy never ceased their attacks. The barbarians, having learned to bypass the main defenses, began using attrition tactics, rare but brutal raids in the rear, cutting communication lines, destroying supplies. Every arrow shot, every spear thrown could spark disaster. One dawn, it became clear. The barrier was weakened, and the enemy launched a massive assault from 3 sides. The warriors of the 9th Legion felt the decisive moment was at hand. Aurelius hurriedly gathered his officers to adjust plans. They understood, now or never. A heavy silence filled the fortress before the storm. The legionaries prepared for the final battle. Everyone knew the outcome would decide many fates. The weight of responsibility rested on Aurelius. He had to be strong and unwavering for his men. In the shadows of the walls, amid thick fog, the first roar of the enemy sounded, a 1,000-strong onslaught, loud and terrifying. The barbarians surged like waves, crashing against the fortress walls, trying to break through at any cost. The legionaries held the assault, taking blows with shields, swords, and sharp spears. Blood mixed with mud, the battle's roar merged with pounding hearts. Despite exhaustion, Aurelius stood at the heart of the fight, directing the battle, guiding troops, raising morale. With every minute, the fight grew fiercer, and it seemed strength was leaving even the strongest. But even when hope seemed lost, the soldiers of the 9th Legion stood like rocks against the storm. During one enemy breach, young Titus was again at the forefront, defending his comrades. His actions helped close the gaps and stabilize the defense. But the cost was high. Many dead and wounded. The silence after the battle was no less terrifying. It echoed with loss and bitterness. Aurelius knew, from this moment, the Legion had no time to rest. They had to find a way not only to hold on, but to survive this brutal war. Every minute was precious, every life invaluable. Among ruins and smoke, beneath these walls where the legionaries' blood soaked the earth, a resolve was born. The legend of the 9th Legion lives on, and as long as the fire beats in their hearts, it will not fade. The flame in the ruins' days turned into months, and the 9th Legion continued to hold on the brink of destruction. Each new dawn brought new trials, and every sunset was a slow loss. But the warriors did not give up. They clung to the flame of their faith, their honor, and their loyalty. Aurelius saw how his soldiers had changed. From strict and disciplined legionaries, they had become hardened veterans, tempered in the fire of war and pain. Their faces were marked with scars, their bodies exhausted, but in their eyes burned the fire of steadfastness. In these ruins, among the debris of the once magnificent camp, they found the strength to move forward. Fortified by spirit and mutual support, they built new barricades, gathered the last supplies they could find, and prepared for the inevitable clash that could be their last. Aurelius often walked through the camp, watching each of his men. He knew many had lost everything they held dear, but they continued to fight not just for life, but for the memory of their brothers fallen on the battlefield. One day, when it seemed the Legion's strength was finally fading, scouts reported the approach of an enemy detachment. These were not mere barbarians. They were well-armed and organized forces aiming to deliver a decisive blow. Aurelius convened a council of officers. They needed to prepare an ambush, using every opportunity and every cover. They studied the terrain map, identifying points where traps and ambushes could be set. On the night before the battle, the legionaries sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Many prayed to the gods. Others prepared for battle, gathering weapons and checking armor. Everyone understood that ahead was not just a fight, but a test of their will and courage. As the first rays of the sun touched the earth, the attack began. The legionaries emerged from their cover, unleashing a hail of arrows and spears upon the enemy. A fierce battle ensued, where every second was precious. Aurelius personally led the fighters, driving them into the attack and inspiring by example. He saw his soldiers fight with desperation and resilience, enemies falling, and legionaries holding their ground, even when all seemed lost. The battle lasted all day. By evening, both sides were exhausted, but the Ninth Legion managed to repel the assault and maintain control over the camp. It was a victory won at a great cost, but it gave hope. Hope that the Legion was still alive and ready to fight on. Aurelius knew many more battles lay ahead, but today, they had won a small war. This victory became a symbol that even when the whole world seems against you, faith and unity can give you the strength to endure any storm. The ghost of the Legion. After a long and bloody battle, a lull settled in. The Ninth Legion had stood firm, but its strength was drained, and the camp's fortifications lay in ruins. Aurelius understood. With each passing day, their situation grew more desperate, and new ways to survive had to be found. In the silence of the camp, among the debris and scattered weapons, a grim atmosphere reigned. The warriors, wounded and exhausted, silently retreated into their thoughts, remembering those they had lost and pondering what lay ahead. Many began to notice that the Legion had become like a ghost, a force that remained only through memory and will. Aurelius gathered small groups to discuss the future. They could not simply wait for the end. They had to act. The Legion was more than just men. It was a symbol of Rome, its backbone on foreign soil, and even if everything collapsed, the spirit of the Ninth could not be destroyed. An idea emerged: to leave the camp and stealthily break through enemy lands to the nearest Roman stronghold, hoping to find help and reinforcements. It was risky. The path was long and full of dangers, but there were no other options. Preparations for the sortie began. The best scouts, guards, and fighters were selected to protect the caravan. Aurelius personally reviewed every plan and route, knowing that a single mistake could be fatal. On the night before the retreat, the legionaries gathered in the center of the camp. Heavy gazes and restrained words, in each burned hope, fear, and resolve. No one knew what awaited ahead, but everyone understood. If they could not make it through, the Ninth Legion would cease to exist. With the first rays of dawn and complete silence, the column began to move, slowly and cautiously, hiding in the shadows of trees and rocks. They left behind the ruins of the camp, leaving traces of destruction and memories. The journey was harsh. Every step could lead to an encounter with the enemy or death from hunger and exhaustion. The soldiers supported each other, sharing their last supplies, carefully tending to those who fell from fatigue. For weeks, hiding and fighting, the Ninth Legion became a nomadic force, maintaining its discipline and honor. It was a struggle not only for life, but for the very existence of a legend. Aurelius knew much more lay ahead, but in the heart of every legionary burned a flame that could not be extinguished. Ashes and shadows. After weeks of wandering through barbarian lands, the Ninth Legion resembled more a ghost than an army. The former grandeur had long since faded. Only tattered standards, cracked armor, and eyes burning with grim resolve remained. Of the 3,000 soldiers who had once proudly marched from the fortress of Eboracum, barely 800 still stood in formation. But each of them was now more than just a soldier. He was a walking legend. Their path took them through lands of tribes, whose names were written on neither maps nor scrolls. These were forgotten forests, rain-drenched bogs, and narrow paths among cliffs, where death could lurk at every turn. By day, the Legion moved silently and carefully, skirting villages, always sending scouts ahead. At night, they made camp without fires, only silent sentries and hushed prayers to Mars and Jupiter. Aurelius slept little. He kept watch on the skies, the woods, and his men. He saw how fear and exhaustion gnawed at them from within. But he knew, the moment discipline broke, the Legion would fall apart. So he stood first and rested last. His quiet strength became the pillar the others leaned on. He allowed himself no weakness. One day the Legion came upon a village that seemed abandoned. The houses were boarded up, the streets empty, but the silence felt unnatural. scouts returned with word, fresh tracks on the surrounding hills. It was a trap. The barbarians were waiting. That day, the Ninth did not flee. Aurelius ordered the village fortified. Homes became bastions. Barricades were set, traps laid, pits dug. They turned the dead village into a fortress. When the attack came, the sound of barbarian horns split the sky. It seemed there were hundreds, thousands of them. They charged with war cries, axes, and spears, like a storm. But the legion held fast. Arrows flew from windows, spears rained down from rooftops. The soldiers were not merely defending, they fought with the fury of men who had no road left behind them. The battle lasted 2 days. On the third, the barbarians withdrew, leaving scores of bodies at the broken barricades. The legion suffered losses, but they endured. Once again, through fire and blood, they moved on. That fight marked a turning point. The legion was no longer a band of fugitives. It had become a silent enemy that survived against all odds. The barbarians began to fear its very name. The Ninth once again carried terror, as in its glorious past. But their journey was far from over. Mountains still lay ahead, the border, the unknown. And as long as their spirit lived, their path would continue, beyond the Roman map. After the battle in the village, the legion no longer hid. It moved slowly, with dignity, as if it were still on imperial soil and not in a wild foreign land. The surviving soldiers kept formation, even if their hands trembled from exhaustion. The legion's eagle, their standard, their soul, was hidden in the center of the column, guarded like a sacred relic. Aurelius knew. They were being watched now. Scouts reported that the barbarians didn't retreat far. They followed at a distance, observing. Tribes that once acted alone were now uniting. Fear brought them together, as did the desire to destroy the Romans before they could reach the border. A confrontation was inevitable, and Aurelius knew it would be the last. Ahead lay a land where even Roman maps ended. There, beyond the mountains, was the fort of Camulodunum, the final outpost at the edge of Britannia, half abandoned and possibly already fallen. Between the legion and the fort lay dozens of miles of wilderness, where no centurion had ever marched. The road was treacherous. Paths vanished under snow. Marshes drowned in gray mist. Rain never ceased. Leather straps rotted, carts broke down. Men fell ill, some died of fever. But the legion moved forward, not because they could, but because they must. Along the way, they found a surviving temple, an ancient sanctuary on a high hill where moss-covered Roman statues still stood, battered by wind and time. Aurelius ordered a halt, not for rest, for honor. The soldiers gathered in silence and in prayer. Each remembered Rome, their homes, their families, the living and the dead. No one spoke of death, only of return, even if none knew whether it was still possible. From the hilltop, they saw smoke. The sky in the distance was gray and black. It was an enemy camp. Thousands of barbarians, an army. They were being awaited. Aurelius understood. Ahead lay a bloodbath. To turn back would mean betraying everything they had endured. He gathered his remaining commanders. On the night before battle, he gave a short order. "We will not die as fugitives. We will die as a legion." They prepared for battle on the move, spears from trees, shields from wreckage. They marched toward the enemy, knowing they were outnumbered 10-1. But each step of their column echoed like the stroke of fate. And there, at the foot of the hills, under Britannia's gray sky, the 9th Legion formed its final battle line, the last shield. The morning began with wind, not a storm, but in its howling was the foreboding of something immense. The ground was wet, the air cold, and all of Britannia seemed to be waiting. Beneath the gray sky stood the remnants of the 9th Legion, fewer than 700 men, worn down with patched armor and shields, darkened by mud and blood. But in their formation was something the enemy could not understand: unbreakable Roman will. Before them lay a plain, beyond which the hills rose. Scattered across the slopes and in the valley were the barbarians, no fewer than 8,000 strong, tribes of different tongues and gods, but with one goal: to crush the legion that, against all odds, still marched forward. Their roar was like the crashing of waves. They beat drums, howled, waved axes. But they didn't charge yet. Aurelius stood at the center of the formation, beside the standard, still cloaked. The eagle of the legion, unseen since the day they had left the fortress. He stared across the field, his jaw clenched. His thoughts were clear. Hold the line until the hour darkens. Then strike. If they were to die, it would not be running. It would be a step from triumph. The legion formed the testudo, the tortoise. Shields locked above and to the sides. The barbarian archers loosed their first wave of arrows. A metal rain that made the recruits flinch, but not the ninth. They held formation. Not a single shield wavered. The soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, one wall. After the second wave of arrows, the barbarians charged. They ran screaming with axes and spears, a human avalanche. But the ninth met them like a cliff. The front line slammed into the shields, and the Romans countered. Not quickly, not beautifully, but mercilessly. Their swords moved like machines: thrust, step back, thrust, step aside. Even in chaos, order, the battle dragged on. The earth drank blood. The air filled with screams, steel clashing, the gasps of the dying. Warriors fell one by one, Roman and barbarian alike, but the legion held. Every foot of ground they fought for was paid in blood. In the third hour of combat, Aurelius gave the order to unveil the eagle. When the standard rose over the field, the barbarians howled in rage. But the legion, as if reborn, pressed forward. The eagle reminded them who they were. Not just soldiers, Romans, warriors of the empire. They advanced, broke the first wave, then the second. They didn't expect to defeat all, but wanted the enemy to remember. The Ninth Legion did not vanish. It fought to the end. It died standing. By nightfall, the field was covered with corpses. The legion still stood. Barely 200 men, but not one had fled. The final march. The next morning, the sun did not rise. It merely pushed faintly through the thick clouds, casting a ghostly gray over the blood-soaked battlefield. Where battle had raged just the day before, now there was silence. Not the silence of peace, but of death. No birds sang. Only vultures circled above the corpses, identifying the dead by scent. The surviving soldiers of the Ninth stood in silence. There was no celebration, no shouting, no raised shields. Victory, if it could be called that, had come at the cost of nearly the entire legion. 237 men remained, out of nearly 5,000, all wounded, many without armor, some with nothing left of their weapons but shards. But in their eyes still burned the same fire that had once led them through Gaul, Hispania, Germania, and now through the heart of dark Britannia. Aurelius, with his arm bandaged and helmet cracked, stood before the eagle of the legion. The standard was bloodied, but still gleamed with bronze. It had not been broken, just like those who had survived. The eagle was lifted, not for the empire, but for the honor of the fallen, for the memory of those who fought beside them. They had to move on. They didn't know if the road to the fort at Camulodunum still existed. It may have already fallen. Perhaps the empire believed them dead. But Aurelius would not stop. Every step forward was a step in defiance. Their path led through marshlands. Where no road existed, they built crossings from broken carts. Where breathing was near impossible, they pressed on silently, carrying the wounded on their backs. Where the earth vanished beneath their feet, they stood firm and climbed up again. Not one asked for mercy. Not one proposed staying behind. Along the way, they found an abandoned settlement. Huts covered in moss, long deserted. But in the center stood a well with clear water. They drank in disbelief. It was their first taste of water without the flavor of blood in weeks. They camped there for the night. Someone lit a fire. Another began to clean a sword, and another prayed. Not to the gods, but to the brothers who were gone. Aurelius sat on a stone by the roadside. He unrolled a scroll, a strip of leather, bearing a list of names. He whispered them aloud, one by one. And every time a name did not answer, he crossed it out. That list was his memory, his duty. If he survived, he would take it to Rome. The names must not be forgotten. When night fell and mist rose over the bogs, the soldiers of the Ninth did not sleep. They stared into the darkness. Eyes watched them from within it. Barbarians, beasts, or ghosts. No one knew. But fear was gone. Only endurance remained. They were no longer mere legionaries. They had become legend. While still alive, the shadow of Rome night covered the Ninth's camp like a shroud. Only the firelight cast trembling shadows on the ground, where weary soldiers saw the ghosts of those who had fallen. No one slept. Not from fear, but because sleep was a privilege of the living, and they felt they had long since crossed that border. They were the shadow of their past, but in that shadow, strength was growing. Aurelius sat leaning against a tree trunk, staring into the horizon. Somewhere out there lay the South. There were roads, cities, walls, and the stone of the empire, stone from which their oath had been carved. He believed that even if the path led through death, it would take them to something greater than survival, to understanding why they had marched through hell. When the mist began to lift, they moved again, slowly, silently. The column moved through swamps, over hills, past the remains of ancient druid circles, as if the very earth watched them, unsure whether to intervene. Some whispered that they heard voices, whispers trying to lead them astray, but the legionaries pressed on in silence. Each step was an act of will. On the third day, they found a body. One of the scouts who had disappeared the day before now hung from a tree, with a symbol carved into his forehead, a snake devouring the sun. It was the mark of a northern tribe long lost to memory. No one living knew their true name, but legend called them the Children of the Cold. These warriors did not fight for glory. They killed for silence, to erase the enemy as if they had never existed. After that discovery, the Legion moved with doubled caution. Night watch was never left alone. Open fires were no longer lit. Every evening, they took count of the living. Those with open wounds had their bandages changed. Those whose minds were slipping were sat by the fire until they steadied. On the seventh day, they reached a river. Wide and fierce, on the opposite bank stood the remains of a collapsed bridge. This was once the road to the southern forts. Now, only water and ruin. Aurelius stood and stared at it for a long time. The moss-covered stones lying in the river felt like the empire itself had fallen and never risen. "We'll build a raft," he said. And so they did. From trees, from wreckage, from the shields of fallen comrades. Every nailed board was an act of faith that the road still existed. The crossing took 2 days. On the second, one raft sank. 10 men went with it, but the rest survived. They emerged on the far shore, wet, exhausted, but alive. When the last man stepped onto the southern bank, Aurelius looked at the Legion's eagle. It was covered in mud, but still standing. And in that moment, every man understood. They had crossed more than just a river. They had crossed a threshold. From now on, the Ninth was not just an army. It was a scar on the face of Britannia, a memory the enemy could never kill. The rift of the empire. After crossing the raging river, the Ninth Legion stood on the shaky shore of a new world, a world where even silence felt hostile. The ground beneath their feet was wet and cold, as if Britannia itself was trying to pull them into its embrace and never let go. Aurelius understood. The way back was closed. They had to move forward, but not just forward along a road. Instead, deep into the unknown, where every path could be their last. The Legion, exhausted and battered, moved slowly, like a living body with nothing left to lose but still struggling to breathe. Aurelius often caught the tired yet unbroken eyes of his comrades. They were not perfect warriors, but they possessed an unshakable will, and that will was stronger than the fear of death. Days blended into nights, and with them grew the rumors. Among local tribes, stories spread of the ghosts of Rome, warriors who could not die, who walked through darkness carrying destruction and fate. The legionaries knew these legends were no accident. They were hunted not only by men, but by the memory of the empire they once served. Aurelius held a scroll with the names of the fallen. He felt the weight of each name as if it were a wound on his soul. But he could not stop. Not now. Moving forward was necessary. Otherwise, death would bring no honor. On the 12th day, they met a caravan of barbarians, not armed, but traders. To exchange goods, hear news, find shelter for a while. This seemed impossible, but they took the risk. The barbarians told them that the imperial armies were gradually retreating south, and a new era of chaos and discord was beginning in Britannia. This news gave the Legion hope, and at the same time unease. If the Empire was abandoning these lands, what awaited them afterward? What dark forces would spread across the British hills? Aurelius realized that the true battle was just beginning. And this battle was not only for survival of the body, but of the soul. The path of no return. The Legion moved ever deeper into the lands of Britannia, where their presence became no more than a whisper in history. Each day was a struggle not only against external enemies, but also against inner despair. Soldiers, once accustomed to strict discipline and clear orders, now faced chaos and uncertainty, where anyone could be an enemy and every step a trap. Aurelius knew that leading his men to safety meant not just showing the way, but preserving their spirit. In camp, he gathered the remaining officers, and together they discussed strategy, not for attack, but for survival. They decided to avoid large settlements, favoring stealthy detours and night marches. Behind them lay ruined forts, abandoned by the Romans, and battlefields where swords once clashed. One dawn, they were surrounded by a group of warriors from a local tribe. Not enemies, but watchers, filled with suspicion and curiosity. After long hours of negotiation and exchange of gifts, a fragile alliance was formed. These tribes knew secret paths and could help the Legion evade pursuers. The mutual trust was weak and fragile, but it gave hope. The Legion split into small groups to avoid attention and began moving south under the cover of night. Each carried a thought of home, a distant, nearly forgotten land where the walls of the empire still stood strong. But the path was strewn with dangers. Hidden behind every tree and bush, barbarians lay in ambush. Sometimes at night, distant cries and sounds of battle echoed. Other times, silence, more terrifying than any scream. The Legion still carried their eagle, the symbol of hope and honor, but every day it became more scratched and covered in mud, as if reflecting the fate of its owners. Aurelius understood that many trials lay ahead, and that losing the eagle meant losing not just a symbol, but the very essence of the Legion. He vowed to protect it at any cost. The last lights of the Empire. The Legion stretched into small groups, moved like shadows through dense forests and dark swamps. Every night was a fight for survival, to hide, to remain silent. Aurelius was constantly on his feet, checking on his men's positions, feeling how the weary soldiers barely held on. Their faces were carved with exhaustion, but their eyes burned with determination, a fire that could not be extinguished. The path wound through lands once traveled by imperial legions. Remnants of stone roads, ruined watchtowers, and crooked gates reminded them of past grandeur. But now, all that remained were empty shells. The Legion could not return there. Those places were now inhabited by others, strangers, and hostile. On the 30th day of the march, at dusk, a small settlement unexpectedly appeared on their path. The tribes living there were wary and reluctantly allowed the Romans into their homes. However, after lengthy negotiations and an exchange of precious gifts between Aurelius and the tribal chief, a temporary agreement was reached. The Legion was granted a place to rest and recover, a rare gift in such harsh conditions. In the camp, among dry branches and smoldering fires, the legionaries shared stories of home, family, and dreams that seemed so distant. But there was also bitterness. Everyone knew that the road back to Rome was now impossible. This was a new battle, a battle for the future, to preserve the honor and memory of their legion no matter what. Aurelius carefully inspected his eagle. Despite numerous scratches and wear, it stood proudly, a symbol of indomitable spirit. That night, as darkness enveloped the camp, he vowed that no enemy, no darkness, would take that symbol from them as long as at least one of them lived. The wind of change. The morning was cold and foggy. The legionaries woke slowly, struggling through exhaustion and the heavy weight settling on each of their shoulders. Aurelius walked among them, watching wounds heal and bodies regain strength, all while knowing there would be no rest. The road ahead showed no mercy. The local tribes, despite the fragile alliance, remained wary. They viewed the Romans as outsiders, strong yet depleted, and at the same time, dangerous. Every movement of the legionaries was carefully watched, every step analyzed. The tribal chief, with whom Aurelius spent long hours talking, spoke of approaching hostile tribes, eager to seize these lands. This knowledge was a heavy burden. The legion could no longer rely on its strength or numbers. Their power now lay in wisdom and caution. Aurelius ordered them to break into even smaller groups, to move unseen, leaving no traces. Every move had to be calculated, every camp carefully concealed. In those days, they ceased to be a legion in the traditional sense. They were a tight-knit group of survivors, holding fast to the memory and honor of a vanished era. Yet, despite everything, the fighter's spirit remained unbroken. They bore scars that told stories of survival, loss, and loyalty. Aurelius often found his thoughts returning to Rome, to the stone streets, the columns, the emperor. All of it now seemed ghostly, almost mythical. But he knew, somewhere far to the south, hope remained. Hope that one day the fire, the symbol of the legion, would be rekindled. Shadows of the past. Many weeks had passed since the legion left the familiar lands of Rome. The path they chose was dangerous and unpredictable. Each morning brought new trials, and each evening took away the remnants of hope. In the soldier's eyes, one could see fatigue and anxiety, but also an unyielding determination not to let the legend perish. Aurelius felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier each day. He knew that commanding such a broken army meant not only managing battles, but also maintaining morale, fighting despair that threatened to consume even the strongest. In the silence of the camp, he often woke from nightmares, hearing the sounds of battle and the cries of comrades lost forever. Their route led them through abandoned ruins of old Roman fortifications where the empire once thrived. These walls, covered with moss and cracks, seemed to witness both greatness and fall. Here, among the stone remnants, legionaries found moments of peace, gathering leftover supplies and crafts to restore what could be used for the journey ahead. But the most important task was to protect the eagle, the symbol of the legion. Over the years of the march, It had acquired scratches and wear, yet still proudly soared above their banners, reminding them of former glory. Losing it would mean losing the very soul of the Legion, and Aurelius did everything to prevent that. One night, when the darkness was especially thick, a rumor spread through the camp, voices of the enemy approaching their refuge. Despite exhaustion, the legionaries rose instantly and took their positions. This was a battle of life and death, a battle that could become the final chapter of their story. The last shield. The night the enemy approached the camp remained etched in the memory of every survivor. The legionaries, barely able to stand, formed a defensive circle around the eagle, as if Mars himself had breathed the last remnants of strength into them. There were no loud cries, no grand speeches, only silent determination. They knew no help would come, no reinforcements, no glory, only duty. The attack began at the hour when the moon disappeared behind thick clouds. Shadows of the enemy poured from the forest, spreading across hills and ravines like the earth itself had risen. But Roman discipline, despite exhaustion, held firm through the first assault. Spears cut through the air, shields thundered under blows from axes and arrows. In the pitch darkness, swords flashed, and every step back was paid for in blood. Aurelius stood at the center of the circle, near the eagle. His armor was blackened with soot, his face cut by fresh wounds. He fought silently, relentlessly, just like his men. The eagle, mounted on its wooden pole, swayed under the wind and impact, but never fell. The battle lasted until dawn, and when the first light pierced the morning mist, the field around them was littered with bodies. The Romans had stood their ground, but at what cost? From 100, barely 30 remained. Those who could still hold a weapon, those who had stood to the last. The tribes who attacked them retreated, leaving behind the dead and stolen lives. They couldn't break the heart of the Legion. But even victory brought no relief. Those who survived knew it was not the end. The Empire didn't know they were still alive. No ships would come. No rescuers. They were abandoned by fate, surviving only because they refused to surrender. Aurelius gathered the survivors. His voice was hoarse but firm. He didn't speak of victory. He spoke of duty, of how the fallen must not be forgotten, that the eagle must be brought to a place where the memory of the ninth would live forever. Oath of the Silent. After the final battle, the remnants of the Ninth Legion stood in absolute silence. No joy, no relief, only the awareness of survival. Every soldier felt it. They were no longer just men, no longer just soldiers. They had become the guardians of a shadow, the last witnesses of a fading legend. No one knew how many more trials awaited them, but none intended to surrender. Aurelius ordered the burning of the fallen, not out of fear of disease, but because none of them could bear to leave their Roman brothers to rot under the open sky. The funeral pyre burned all night, and the smoke rose above the hills as if the soul of the Legion was bidding farewell to the land of Britannia. Many cried, not aloud, not sobbing, but standing still, fists trembling from restrained emotion. After the rite, a new march began. The remnants of the Legion, now barely 30 men, left their temporary camp. They marched in silence, not lifting their eyes to the sky. The Legion's eagle, wrapped in cloth and fixed on a new pole, was carried in turns with honor and care. For them, it had become not just a symbol, but the very heart of the fallen empire, a fragment of the soul of every fallen comrade. They avoided roads, slipped through forests and swamps, skirted settlements. The Briton tribes still searched for them, sending scouts, but the survivors of the Ninth were no longer easily found. Their steps had grown quieter, their movements sharper, their instincts honed. They had become shadows, men whom Roman bureaucracy would soon record as missing without trace. After several days of travel through hills and ravines, Aurelius made a decision. They were no longer a legion. They were a brotherhood of survivors, and their mission now was not to seek rescue, not to return home, but to reach the northernmost edges of the island, where in seclusion far from enemy hands and friendly eyes, they would hide the eagle, not as a trophy, but as a testament, a memory, the nameless path. They marched ever farther north, into lands where the earth grew wild, where Roman maps faded into guesswork, and the laws of the empire became a distant echo. Each day was no longer just a test of the body. It was a test of the spirit. Snow capped the hilltops, mists curled over lakes, and the silence of these lands felt older than time itself. Their supplies were nearly gone. Hunting became a daily necessity, and icy streams replaced wine. The legionaries' bodies were scratched and bruised by branches, their faces rough with beards and cuts. They no longer looked like soldiers, but their bearing still carried discipline. The eagle traveled with them like a sacred relic. Not one man would have let even the wind touch it carelessly. At night, they sat around campfires and remained silent, not because there was nothing to say, but because any word might shatter the fragile balance between hope and despair. Some remembered family, others comrades, who had fallen in the swamps of Britannia. One of them, the old centurion Licinius, quietly carved the names of the fallen into a wooden plaque, vowing to one day set it into the wall of a temple. One morning they saw a rock face, vast, black, seemingly scorched by time. Aurelius halted the group. He silently looked around. The voiceless forests, the sharp wind from the north, no road behind. This was the place. Here, on this cold, God-forsaken cliff, the eagle would find rest. They began to dig, at first with their hands, then with stones and iron. The pit they carved was deep, like a grave, not just for the symbol, but for the memory, for everything they had lost. The eagle was wrapped in a wool cloak and lowered into the ground with such care as if it were a living soul. No speech was made. Only Licinius placed the plaque nearby, inscribed with the names and the Latin phrase, non oblivioni sed silentio, not to oblivion but to silence. From that place they turned south, not toward Rome, but toward where they could vanish into legend. Their faces disappeared from records, their names missed by chroniclers. But among the hills of Britannia remained a stone no one dared disturb. Shadows of the empire. Many years had passed since the remnants of the 9th Legion disappeared into the northern lands of Britannia. Their fate was never recorded in military logs or provincial reports. The Eternal City moved on. Amphitheaters were built, rulers changed hands, and new legions marched through Albion as if nothing had happened. The 9th became a ghost, silent but not forgotten. But history does not vanish. It sleeps, only to speak again, in the rustle of leaves, the cry of a raven, or the crackle of fire at a forgotten camp. The legend of the 9th lived not in books, but in people, in the whispers of Celtic elders, in the frightening bedtime tales of mothers, in strange signs carved into stones as if by the shadows themselves. The few who survived the march scattered across the land. Some found shelter in isolated Celtic villages, passing themselves off as mercenaries, exiles, or simply quiet wanderers. Over time, they learned the language, started families, but in their eyes remained the stern bearing of Roman discipline. They carried within them the Roman code, even among wild tribes: honor, order, and a silent belief that they still served, though without orders, banners, or an army. Centurion Aurelius was the last to leave the burial place of the eagle. He stayed there for several days, guarding the relic, as if waiting for someone, perhaps someone from Rome, or perhaps Britannia itself, as a living force, to give him a sign that all was complete. But no one came. Before leaving, he removed his fibula, an iron clasp engraved with the number 9, and drove it into the stone beside Licinius's plaque. It was his final act as a commander. Not a command, not a battle, not a victory, but a mark. Quiet and defiant. He went east and was never seen again. Some said he lived to old age in a monastery by the sea. Others claimed he died protecting a Celtic village from a Pict raid, and others believed he became a spirit, forever guarding the lost eagle among the hills. In Rome, decades later, a young legate once asked an old archivist about the 9th Legion. The archivist simply shrugged, "Unknown. They went north and never came back. Probably wiped out, perhaps betrayed. Or maybe they became something more than an army." "More?" the legate asked. "A legend," said the old man. "And legends don't answer to reports. They answer to silence." Thus, the story of the 9th Legion remained. Part of the British mists, part of fear in the hearts of enemies, part of the memory of Rome itself. And somewhere among the heathered hills, beneath wind and rain, the Legion's eagle still sleeps, not defeated, not forgotten, just silent. The end.